When I was 17, I read a book called Madness and Civilization by some philosopher, and at the time I did not get it. I thought I did, but I profoundly didn't. The idea that there existed a counter-logic and insanity that simply couldn't be coherently communicated felt right to me, sure, but only so far as the anti-conformism it carried within itself was appealing to my youthful self. For as much as I wanted to agree, I could not truly buy into it on the terms that it was presenting. What worth was truth if it couldn't be communicated, after all? Not that this is particularly relevant, but the years of journalism that have passed between being that kid and now must have rotted my brain to a point where setting stories up this way is a reflex beyond my conscious control, an ossified stylistic touch. It's sort of difficult to reconcile the idea of conscious control with the actions I took that day, and since. But this tangent too isn't all that important. Not much is nowadays, though I want to be very clear that I have not gone insane. If anything, I have learned what it is to be sane in the first place. All thanks to that woman and her... Let me start over again. All of this began at a lab in Orfield, the quietest place on Earth. By no means is the isolation room underreported on, however, it's the kind of story that gets clicks, as my younger colleagues say, and the experience account format allows for a bit more self-expression than most of my day-to-day reporting. In addition, I got a free trip out of the article, which made the endeavor genuinely a good deal. The plan was pretty simple. I would go to the lab, spend some time alone in the silence chamber, as they allow journalists to do, and make a turgid attempt to break the record time, as everyone thinks they could without problem, fail, and earn some money with my navel gazing. Easy enough, right? How could I possibly have messed up? Let's just say that I didn't have to enter the lab to experience what true silence feels like. Really true silence. To be ripped out of the world of sensations entirely. The woman was dressed rather plainly, Middle Eastern and with very short hair, but it was her fierce gaze that pulled me towards where she sat when I left the station. Not for a second do I believe she blinked during our encounter, and could sooner be convinced that the eyes spray-painted on the wall behind her did so. It wasn't an action her face struck me as capable of. Do you know about that study that showed how people come up with rationalizations for why they did something after the fact? It's a result of imperfect communication between hemispheres or something like that. It's really quite fascinating. Though I only drew that connection later, and I'm rather convinced that this too is a rationalization. For all I know, I suddenly found myself standing directly in front of what I assumed at the time to be a homeless woman, and decided that the only reason I would have had for this was that I wanted to give her money. As you well know, my pockets have never run deep, but charity is still something I occasionally engage in. Without there being a hat or bowl or anything of the likes, I simply extended my hand with the change, waiting for her to take it and feeling a tad awkward, since the more I thought about it, her sitting on the ground was really the only cue I had that she might be a beggar. The augur shook her head. Nothing more, but I suddenly knew that was what she was. More than that, the fact suddenly seemed as obvious as the color of the sky, and the idea that I could have not known once drifted rapidly into the train of the absurd. I sat down. She had concluded that I had understood and no longer bothered with the gestures, with the pretense that she had to move any muscle at all to convey her desires. And her desire was for me to sit and to listen. At first it was faint, barely noticeable beneath the sounds of the station, the traffic and the voices, but as I focused, as she stared into me, the silence beneath grew louder and more noticeable. The absolute vastness of pure lack, which society tried with such verve to drown out, but which would always be there, only distracted from but never truly gone, waiting for the day that our efforts should be exhausted. It was beautiful. Were there still need for signals? I assume she would have nodded approvingly, but instead she simply allowed me to look through her eyes, to behold all of creation in its frozen, crystalline quiet. It was an easy task now that the interference was gone, simply a thought, first in one hemisphere, then another, first in my head, then in hers. The idea that is me, that comprises me, considered by another with the instruments to make me see. I saw you, talking over coffee with one of your tennis friends, and I saw galaxies dying. I saw the sun rise above the horizon of a planet at the very edge of existence. and I saw the Orfield lab experimenting with that risible little thing they call silence. I saw and understood it all. Then I rose. It felt insulting to use such a crude instrument as language to thank her, and she knew of my gratitude regardless, so I left wordlessly and without looking back. Not much thought went into me quitting afterwards. It simply felt the right thing to do, and I must admit that I've been somewhat lost since. Adrift. I would not call it soul-searching, much less a midlife crisis, as my former colleagues have chosen to classify my actions, since there's no point in searching for something whose whereabouts you know precisely, and since I do not believe that I have ever been farther from a crisis. I do wonder if I should seek it out, however. The silence. Sometimes when I stand very still and focus, I can hear it.